The room looked sterile, yet it smelled like fear. Fluorescence hummed above a billionaire in handcuffs, his wrists red where metal kissed skin. Through the one-way glass, a child stood small and still. A glossy magazine lay open, his triumphant face frozen mid-smile. The guard pretended not to see the shaking shoulders. The child's reflection overlaid the man's profile, a ghost on a monument. He stared as if time owed him mercy. It did not. The clock ticked without sympathy, slicing silence into smaller silences. Somewhere beyond the walls, cameras clicked like hungry insects. A voice said, "He built an empire, but he couldn't save her." The words landed, heavy as iron on bone. No one moved, except the tear that forgot to hide. The glass tower glittered like a lighthouse in a storm, but it felt like a tomb. In the corner office, a CEO folded over a desk, shoulders racked by a private weather. City lights swam on the windows like restless fish. A magazine with his smiling face lay open, headline bright, truth dim. He covered his mouth as if he could dam the tide. The skyline offered trophies, but none could buy off consequence. The office plants leaned toward the night, thirsty and indifferent. A watch on the desk muttered seconds in a cold accent. The voice from nowhere returned, "He built an empire, but he couldn't save her." The sentence found a home in the quiet and refused to leave. He pressed his forehead to the glass, and for a heartbeat it pushed back. In a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and rain, a child waited with solemn patience. The walls held posters about safety that now read like apologies. Her shoes left damp crescents on tile, a timeline made of water. Nurses passed in soft shoes, their kindness unable to lift the air. The vending machine blinked choices, none of them comfort. She watched the door where truth would eventually walk in. Somewhere far above, a tower shone like a coin flipped and lost. The world felt too large for a small hand, and a smaller bench. The clock's red digits counted forward and backward at once. The voice, almost kind, said, "He built an empire, but he couldn't save her." The sentence curled around her like a draft. Outside the precinct, cameras nested like startled birds. A black sedan idled, while sirens braided with rain. Inside the back seat, a man stared at his reflection in the divider, and saw someone richer and poorer than yesterday. The red-blue wash painted him royal and ruined. A 38-year-old officer checked paperwork with hands that had cuffed 1,000 stories. Reporters spoke in questions shaped like verdicts. The sedan's wipers dragged a heartbeat across the windshield. The sky threatened thunder and mercy, and delivered neither. A tremor went through the crowd as doors unlocked in sequence. The voice arrived again. "He built an empire, but he couldn't save her." The echo found metal and multiplied. Back in the room that loved the sound of nothing, the stare resumed. The billionaire lifted his head as if from deep water and found the child again through the glass. Their reflections aligned like a cruel family portrait. The metal on his wrists announced itself each time he breathed. She raised her palm, not in greeting, but to measure distance. The clock marked 6 more seconds, and made them eternal. A chair leg settled, the tiny sound sharp as a blade. Rain softened, then hardened, then softened again. The magazine smiled where it lay, a fossil of better weather. The voice spoke once, final as a seal. "He built an empire, but he couldn't save her." The sentence lingered like smoke after a match. Dawn rinsed the city in nickel light as Victor Hale stood before the shuttered shop his father once kept alive. Dust filmed the windows like old breath, and the padlock sat where pride used to sit. He traced the ghost letters on the sign, and felt the throat pinch that never healed. Rent notices had once bloomed here like weeds no one could pull. Victor Hale said, "I will never be refused again," and the words tasted like metal. Inside, a cracked ledger slept under a film of years, numbers marching toward 0.ao. He remembered the day the landlord taped the paper and did not meet their eyes. Martin Hale had folded the keys into a fist and shook without sound. The boy Victor learned that shame is a solvent stronger than tears. He stared through his reflection, and saw an empire built from that fist. The street woke around him, and a delivery truck hissed like a warning he would not forget. Clara Reed stood outside a boardroom where glass turned into a wall the moment she arrived. The badge reader blinked red, and the receptionist's smile carried policy like a shield. Inside, suits debated ethics as if numbers were weather. Clara held her report like a flare no one wanted lit. Clara Reed said, "The risk is human," and the guard studied the carpet to avoid agreement. She learned that clever doors close softly and stay closed. A mentor walked past with a nod that weighed nothing. The hallway smelled of toner and lemon, a clean disguise for dust. Her reflection on the glossy wall looked steady and tired at once. She wrote a note to herself that read, "Ask louder next time." The elevator arrived with a breath, and she swallowed the sting, saving it for fuel. That evening, Clara stopped at a discount store for a notebook and found a scene that felt like a note written to her past. A boy sat alone on a plastic bench, legs not yet long enough to touch the floor. His mother pleaded at the counter in a voice trained to be small. The manager listened with the caution of someone afraid of rules and rent. The fluorescent lights hummed a song about margins. Clara Reed said, "I know this language," and she watched the boy count the holes in a ceiling tile. She remembered waiting while her own mother bartered hope for hours. The receipt printer chattered like judgment, and then stopped. The mother left with a promise that was not a promise. Clara bought the notebook and added a line to her report. "Policies are people wearing paper." Night draped Victor's apartment in a quiet thin as ice, and the kitchen table carried bills that rustled when he breathed. He touched the past due stamp and felt the old shop tug at his sleeve. Victory had come, but it spoke in clauses and clawbacks and sleeplessness. Victor Hale said, "Control is the only apology I can afford," and the refrigerator answered with a tired hum. He remembered the first investor who called him kid with a smile that bit. He remembered the handshake that taught him gloves can hide knives. The skyline blinked through the window like a scoreboard pretending to be a star field. He folded each bill into a neat stack, as if order could bridle fear. The room stayed small, and his name felt too loud inside it. Somewhere a siren braided with wind and promised nothing. The city drew its curtains with rain, and two lives rode the late bus in opposite directions of the same ache. Victor Hale stared into the wet glass and counted the buildings that once turned him away. Clara Reed traced a sentence on fog with a finger and let it fade. Victor Hale said, "Never again," and the words sank like a coin into deep water. Clara Reed said, "Not this time," and the letters vanished, but did not leave. The driver watched the road as if it might forgive him. Neon bled across the aisle and painted both faces in the same palette. Their stops were strangers, but their cargo matched: shame, fire, and an address labeled tomorrow. The brakes sighed, and the city exhaled with them. The doors opened, and the rain wrote applause no one heard. Night bled into morning, as monitors glowed like low moons across the war room. Coffee steamed from paper cups that wore rings on the table like tree years. Victor Hale paced the glass, counting risks like beads. Victor Hale said, "We launch in 6 weeks, no slippage." The wall filled with arrows, acronyms, and numbers that sounded like promises. Clara Reed mapped red boxes around anything that could fail and still look fine. Clara Reed said, "Safety interlocks must stage before rollout." He felt his pulse drum in his jaw and mistook it for momentum. A courier slid documents through the door as if feeding a furnace. Victor Hale said, "Hold margins, trim latency, keep the story clean." Clara Reed said, "We need 2 weeks of buffer, or we move the harm forward." The team nodded because fatigue loves agreement. The sun rose like a warning no one had time to read. Victory felt near enough to taste and far enough to lose everything. The win came as an email that used fireworks where facts should live. Victor Hale read it in an empty office and listened for joy that did not answer. His phone showed a missed call from his sister, candles in the thumbnail already tilting. Victor Hale said, I will make it up to you, to a voicemail already saving itself. The cake in the photo sagged like a flag at half-mast. A courier arrived with a pen that had signed too many lives. The printer sang a victory jingle while the clock shook its head. He drafted a reply that sounded generous and landed thin. The skyline twitched as the storm changed channels. Victor Hale said, "Book the roadshow," and the words felt like lint he could not brush away. The email confetti faded to gray, which matched the room. He closed the laptop as if closing a door that would not stay shut. Clara Reed watched her spreadsheet crawl like a patient heartbeat. Her messages stacked into a quiet argument she was too tired to finish. A partner wrote, "You live at work," and the dots kept typing like rain. Clara Reed said, "This report cannot be late, and it cannot be wrong." She drew a red line under a vendor who treated rules like rumors. The office AC whispered bargains about staying just one more hour. A cleaning crew moved through with the mercy of soft bristles and closed eyes. Clara Reed said, "I will send it by dawn," and the sentence felt like a vow sewn from wire. Outside, the last train stitched silver across the dark. Her phone dimmed to black and took a future with it. She breathed into cupped hands and found resolve instead of warmth. The cursor blinked like a metronome counting a cost. The press stage glittered like a promise dressed for television. Victor Hale took the podium and let the microphones drink his breath. Victor Hale said, "Today we welcome Orion Freight into our family." Applause rose like steam and vanished just as quickly. Clara Reed stood off stage with a binder that weighed what truth weighs. Clara Reed said, "We should confirm the pilot safety metrics before scaling." He smiled as if the word safety were a friendly mascot. Flash bulbs stitched a crown he did not feel worthy to wear. The new logo spun behind him like a coin that never lands. Investors smiled with teeth that remembered every clause. The speech ended on a chord engineered to linger. The room cheered while the ledger looked away. The warehouse roared like weather trapped indoors. Conveyor belts blinked status lights that looked cheerful until you listened. A checklist lay on a clipboard with a box that wanted a lie. Victor Hale walked the catwalk and tasted the quarter's edge in his mouth. Victor Hale said, "We ship tonight, or we miss the window." Forklifts traced careful arcs around pallets that leaned like tired men. Clara Reed followed a trail of exceptions that felt too convenient. Clara Reed said, "We need the interlock test run again at full load." A supervisor nodded in a way that meant later. The schedule glared from a screen that cared more than anyone. Victor Hale stared at the clock and counted reputations. The belt sped up, and the floor seemed to tilt. Cost rose like tide against their shoes. Clara Reed's screen froze on a buried compliance file dated months before Orion's launch. The report spoke in numbers but screamed in injury. Clara Reed said, "This never made it to the board." Her pulse found a new rhythm, sharp and fast. The signature at the bottom belonged to a man she trusted. Cross-referencing logs felt like digging in a mine where air was rationed. The graphs told of a warehouse accident involving a child, marked as resolved but never repaired. She remembered the safety meeting where this case was absent like a missing tooth. Clara Reed said, "This is not an omission, this is a burial." The fluorescent glare burned a halo into her vision. Outside, the city dragged shadows across glass towers, but her world shrank to the cursor's blink. The chain of sign-offs led up the ladder like a fuse. It ended with Victor Hale's name, written in ink she could almost smell. In his office, Victor Hale read the email Clara sent, each line pulling threads from the fabric he'd wrapped around himself. The subject line was only 3 words, "You should know." Victor Hale said, "I already did," but the room had no one to hear it. The report lay on his desk like a confession written by a stranger with his hand. The accident file dated before Orion's expansion turned the air thick. He saw the mentor's signature, bold and certain, and remembered the day he'd signed below without reading every page. A sound like paper tearing came from somewhere in his head. Victor Hale said, "Not this," but the ink was old, and the harm older. The skyline blurred behind rain, as if the city itself was unwilling to meet his gaze. He closed the folder knowing it would not stay closed. Clara waited in the service elevator lobby, the hum of machinery louder than her thoughts. She clutched the report as if it might vanish if she loosened her grip. Victor arrived, his shoes quiet on the concrete. Clara Reed said, "We have to take this higher." He looked at the pages, then at her, measuring the gap between self-preservation and truth. The elevator doors opened, like an argument with no winner. The ride up felt longer than it should. Floor numbers ticked past with the patience of gravity. Victor Hale said, "If we light this fuse, there's no way back." Clara Reed said, "If we don't, we're part of it." Neither spoke after that, letting the cables groan for them. When the doors slid open, the boardroom hall waited like a mouth about to close. The boardroom was already in session, laughter muffled by the heavy door. Victor entered first, his face a practiced mask. Clara set the report in front of the chair at the head of the table. The mentor's eyes caught hers, then flicked to Victor, a silent warning passing between them. The smell of coffee and cologne couldn't cover the scent of unease. Victor Hale said, "Before we begin, there's something you need to see." Chairs creaked as bodies leaned forward. Clara Reed said, "This is a safety report that was never disclosed." A rustle moved around the table, like a wind that carried doubt. The mentor's smile held for 3 beats, then cracked. A director asked, "Is this substantiated?" Victor answered without looking away from the mentor, "It is, and I signed it." Silence bloomed like a bruise. After the meeting, the hallway felt longer than the building could hold. The mentor passed Victor without slowing, his voice low and sharp, "You just signed your own exile." Victor Hale said, "Then I'm not going alone." Clara walked beside him, the report now lighter but no less dangerous. Outside, the storm had broken, leaving the pavement slick with reflection. They stopped under the awning where the city smelled washed and metallic. Clara Reed said, "You know what happens next." Victor looked up at the tower's glowing name, the same one on the magazine cover that now felt like a lie. Victor Hale said, "We start telling it right." Somewhere, a siren wailed for a reason that had nothing to do with them, but everything to do with the story they'd just set in motion. Morning gathered in the boardroom, like a verdict that preferred daylight. The table shone with the polish of 1,000 confident hands. Victor Hale stood at the head, and felt smaller than the wood. Victor Hale said, "Call the roll." The mentor smiled, as if weather could be charmed by teeth. Clara Reed placed the report between them, like a blade wrapped in paper. Clara Reed said, "We keep the room open, and we record everything." Directors glanced at one another, counting loyalties and exits. The city beyond the glass held its breath over traffic. Victor remembered a padlock on a failed shop, and knew what locks do. He looked at the empty chair saved for outside counsel, and welcomed the witness it implied. Victor Hale said, "No redactions, no edits, no delays." Clara met his eyes, and nodded once, sealing a strange and necessary alliance. The room settled, and microphones caught the breath before the words. Victor Hale said, "I led this company, and I set targets that rewarded speed over care." The sentence landed with weight he could not hand off. He named the vendors, the deadlines, the shortcuts that wore new names. He named the child as a person, and not a metric. Victor Hale said, "This ends with me, and it starts again without my excuses." The mentor shifted, as if the chair bristled. He refused legal softness, and spoke in nouns that could not wriggle. He waved the parachute, and kept the liability. He asked for independent oversight and restitution first. The city horns below sounded, like a chorus of impatient clocks. Victor Hale said, "You will vote on my removal, and I will vote yes." The table did not move, but the ground did. Clara took the floor with a binder that did not tremble in her hands. Clara Reed said, "This is the timeline of decision and consequence." Slides lit the wall with dates that refused to be friends. She traced the alert that blinked, and the email that soothed it. She showed the safety interlock test that passed at half load. Clara Reed said, "This is the fuse, and here is the match." She named the oversight, and the names behind it. She read the clause that turned risk into rumor. She laid out restitution as a map, not a gesture. She proposed monitors who would answer to no buyer and no friend. Clara Reed said, "Truth is the cheapest fix we can still afford." The projector hummed like a live wire, and no one reached to unplug it. The mentor rose with a smile that had done so much heavy lifting. He praised growth and scolded panic. He offered a scapegoat shaped like nobody. Victor Hale said, "Stop." The word arrived clean and unarmed. He refused the fiction and left himself in the open. The chair called the vote with a voice that usually sold certainty. Hands lifted, and the air learned a new temperature. Victor raised his own hand first and felt something loosen in his chest. Clara did not vote, but her gaze did not blink. The count ended, and titles shifted like plates under a city. The chair announced removal and cooperation with regulators. The company exhaled, and the future inhaled. In the atrium below, light fell like mercy through a grid of glass. A 37-year-old father held his 8-year-old daughter in a hug that spoke fluent silence. Victor stopped a few steps away and let the moment be theirs. The child's crutch tapped once like a metronome for courage. Clara Reed said, "No cameras here," and the security line obeyed. Victor Hale said, "I am sorry," and the words were small and right. The father nodded, not granting absolution, but acknowledging the work. Papers rustled with new signatures that would not be hidden. The elevator chimed, and the day continued as if it had not changed. But something had shifted, and even the floor seemed to know. The girl smiled once at the light, and the story found its peak. The office Victor once ruled now felt borrowed. He packed his personal effects into a single box, each item a quiet witness. A photo of the shop with his father stared back from the frame. Victor Hale said, "We built from nothing, and I broke it." The skyline outside was sharp and cold, like it could cut anyone who leaned too close. Clara Reed stood in the doorway, not speaking, because some exits need silence. The hum of the building no longer included his name. He touched the glass wall, leaving no print, as if he'd never been there. A pen rolled across the desk, bumping the report he'd signed in truth. Victor Hale said, "It's better this way." The elevator bell chimed, patient and final. He walked past the boardroom without glancing inside, the echo of his steps folding into the carpet's muted pattern. The hearing room smelled of wood polish and faint coffee. Victor sat at a long table under the unblinking eyes of regulators. The child's father sat 2 chairs away, shoulders broad with quiet anger. Victor Hale said, "I accept full responsibility for the decisions under my tenure." His voice held no tremor, but the weight was visible in his hands. Clara Reed presented her audit findings with clinical precision, stripping away rhetoric. A stenographer tapped the record into permanence. The lead investigator asked if restitution could be completed within the year. Victor Hale said, "It will be." The air in the room was heavy with consequence, but free of denial. Outside, the courthouse clock ticked toward a future built on paper and will. Weeks later, Clara walked the floor of a smaller, leaner Orion freight. Safety posters now outnumbered marketing banners. Young Wines Commerce. Clara Reed said, "Every shipment passes the checklist before it moves." Forklift operators wore new vests with sensors that hummed softly. She met with supervisors who had stopped using the phrase, "good enough." The hum of machinery felt steadier, as if relieved of guilt. In the break room, a bulletin board carried thank you notes from staff. Clara Reed said, "It's not about being perfect, it's about being accountable." Outside, trucks rolled out slower but surer. She sent Victor a brief message. "Systems holding." He replied simply, "Good." It was the first time the word felt whole. Victor's apartment was stripped of the trappings of office life. The dining table now held legal pads, a battered laptop, and sketches for a non-profit freight safety council. Victor Hale said, "It won't be a business, it'll be a standard." He spoke to no one but himself, yet the words stayed in the air. A pot of coffee cooled beside him, forgotten. On the wall, a corkboard tracked outreach to unions, regulators, and community groups. He moved a pin from maybe to confirm. The rain tapped against the window like a reminder of unfinished promises. Victor smiled faintly, not at what was done, but at what might be next. The rehab clinic smelled faintly of lemon and soap. Ouch. Victor stood at the edge of the therapy room as the child took slow, measured steps between parallel bars. Her father walked alongside, hands ready but not holding. Clara Reed arrived quietly, her bag slung over one shoulder. Victor Hale said, "She's faster than last time." The girl's eyes flicked to him, a brief acknowledgement. No speeches followed, just the rhythm of steps and breath. Outside, sunlight pooled in the courtyard, patient and bright. Clara Reed said, "Some things don't need fixing, just tending." Victor nodded, feeling the truth settle into him. The child reached the end of the bars and smiled. It was enough. Evening settled over the clinic courtyard, and the air smelled like damp leaves and new paint. Lanterns hummed above a small crowd that learned to cheer softly. The 8-year-old girl eyed the 3 shallow steps, as if they were mountains. The 37-year-old father stood beside her, hands open, ready if asked. Victor Hale watched from the bench and hid his hope in stillness. Clara Reed tracked the therapist's nod and breathed with the rhythm. The girl lifted her foot, found the rail, and tested the floor for truth. Victor Hale said, "Only if you want to," and the words carried no weight. She took one step, then a second, then laughed at the surprise of balance. The little crowd clapped like rain on a tin roof, and then went quiet. Clara Reed said, "Strong work," and the child flashed a quick grin. Victor found his breath again and let it go without apology. Somewhere beyond the hedges, the city began testing fireworks for the weekend. The visitation room wore its paint like a confession no one framed. A guard opened the door, and 60-year-old Graham Pike entered without his suit. Victor Hale stayed seated, hands crossed, eyes clear of rage. Graham Pike said, "You ruined us," and the words reached for the old leash. Victor Hale said, "I ruined the lie." Graham Pike smiled like a cracked plate pretending to hold soup. He offered a history where accidents were prices and silence a skill. Victor Hale said, "I learned that from you, and I am returning it now." He slid a thin folder across, an affidavit about the buried report. Graham Pike said, "You think they will thank you?" And the room seemed to shrink. Victor Hale said, "I think a child will walk further," and nothing else mattered. The clock clicked once, and the guard cleared his throat for the end. Victor stood, leaving the chair warmer and the past colder. The Union Hall smelled of coffee, ink, and corduroy coats drying by vents. Banners for the Freight Safety Council hung straight and unglamorous. Clara Reed said, "Signatures here, oversight here, hotline here," and pens began their work. Victor Hale stood off to the side, letting the table carry the spotlight. The 37-year-old father added his name with careful strokes and squared his shoulders. The 8-year-old girl pressed a blue handprint onto a pledge board and giggled. A regulator nodded, as if a long argument had finally learned manners. Reporters took notes without flash, respecting the room's plain power. Clara Reed said, "We audit ourselves before anyone has to," and hands kept moving. Victor Hale said, "Hold us to it," and the phrase felt like a bridge. Outside, trucks rolled past, slower than before and prouder than before. The hall doors opened, and cold air entered like a promise. At the old storefront, scaffolding wrapped yesterday in careful metal. A new sign read Community Logistics Lab, small and stubborn. Victor Hale held the rusty padlock like a storybook without pictures. Clara Reed said, "Let it be a relic, not a rule," and opened a shadow box. He placed the lock inside and pinned a card with a date no one could forget. The 37-year-old father arrived with donation receipts for therapy gear. The 8-year-old girl tested the ramp that replaced the step and smiled. Neighbors peered from doorways, weighing the trade between pride and use. Victor Hale said open hours start at dawn, and the words felt like light. Clara Reed sketched a flyer that invited students to learn safety by doing. A bus sighed at the curb as if endorsing the plan. The city kept moving, but this corner finally had something to keep. Night folded over the river, and unfolded again in fireworks. The skyline glowed like a circuit, finally grounded. The 8-year-old girl stood on the boardwalk and leaned into the railing with delight. The 37-year-old father watched her balance with his hands in his pockets. Clara Reed traced the reflections and measured the quiet between bursts. Victor Hale stood a step behind them and let his eyes stay on the child. He thought of the boardroom that once defined him and felt nothing pull. Clara Reed said, "You kept the hard promise," and he shook his head once. Victor Hale said, "She did the hard part," and the river answered with light. The fireworks smoke bent in the wind like a curtain about to close. The voice said, "He left the company, but never left her." Silence followed, deep enough to keep